Time for the big three in today's topics. Making the case, safe seat, and this week's must-reads. Let's bring in my panel. Acting politics editor for Roll Call, Shira Toeplitz. MSNBC contributor and former Bush-Cheney senior advisor Robert Traynham, who's also a Georgetown University dean, and former senior advisory to Hillary Clinton and president of Hathaway Communications, Doug Hathaway. Good to have you all here. So let's get right to it as we begin with you, Robert. Some Republicans are now publicly supporting same-sex marriage, including Ohio Senator Rob Portman, but of course many remain opposed. This latest poll, though, shows 58% of Americans now support same-sex marriage, compared to only 36% support back in 2006. New York Times columnist David Brooks here on Meet the Press. Let's listen.
The trend is pretty amazing. Listen, we've had 5,000 years of Western civilization. Has there ever been a society that's given complete equality to gays and lesbians until ours and currently Western Europe? No. This is a big historic moment. And the movement, I think, is just overwhelming and gradual and almost irreversible.
So what kind of a struggle does same-sex marriage pose to the Republican Party and our opponents of it on the wrong side of history here?
Yes, absolutely. Look, Alex, this is, I agree with everything that David said earlier this morning on Meet the Press. This is the civil rights movement, if you will, for the 21st century. The 19th century, obviously, was women's rights, beginning part of the 19th century, middle part of the 19th century, obviously, for African Americans. You know, what's wrong, and now, obviously, for gay and lesbian Americans, what's wrong with gay and lesbian Americans being able to enter into a relationship that is recognized by the state and by the government so that they're able to pass along their material and so forth on to other generations and to share that? There's nothing wrong with that, and this is certainly not a threat to traditional marriage. So, yes, the Republicans out there and also some Democrats are on the wrong side of history here. There's no question about it that this is a tidal wave that will happen sooner rather than later.
Doug, the Supreme Court is not expected to announce a ruling on these cases until sometime later this summer, but what do you think are the potential political implications, whatever the court decides?
Yeah, no matter what they decide, this is going to put this very high on the public agenda. That's going to galvanize people on both sides of the issue, and I think following up on what Robert just said, I think the upside goes to the politicians who support the freedom to marry. If you look at the electorate, voters under 40 are going to be nearly half the national electorate in the next presidential election. 80% of them support the freedom to marry. So the political dynamics are changing quickly. This is going to put it high on the agenda, meaning people are going to start voting on this issue, particularly young voters. So I think whichever way it goes, if the Supreme Court decided against it, for example, I think a lot of young voters will be really galvanized around it and turn out and get more engaged. So it's a really interesting dynamic we're going to see.
So, Shira, as we look back to the 2012 election, that was all about the economy. How do you think this issue of same-sex marriage and the Supreme Court's decision expected later in the summer, how do you think that's going to play into the 2014 midterms and maybe 2016 general election?
Right. Well, it depends, first of all, how the court is going to rule on these two cases, the Defense of Marriage Act and California's Proposition 8. It depends how they rule. It could either, as Doug pointed out, galvanize supporters or those against it. But I wonder if it will still be a central issue in 2014. The economy is so slow to come back right now. It's hard to imagine that voters are really going to care about this issue as deeply as they did in, for example, 2004, when they're worried about things like paying their mortgage and their own economic well-being. I think 2016 will be much more fascinating lens into how the public views this issue. I mean, if you look at just in the 8 years from 2008 to 2016, how much the Democratic Party and even to a lesser degree the Republican Party has changed on the issue. You had 3 of the top candidates support civil unions. 3 of the top Democratic candidates support civil unions. 2008 have now completely come out for gay marriage. It's going to be very interesting. And I wouldn't be surprised if you saw top Republican candidates come out and make a states' rights argument. Those who are leaning towards supporting gay marriage, that's the argument they would make in 2016.
All right, guys, let's move on to safe seat, our next topic. Shira, this recent article in Politico says Kentucky Democrats trying to woo another Democrat besides Ashley Judd to run against Senator Mitch McConnell in 2014. Secretary of State Allison Grimes, what's the latest you're hearing there?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's set the stakes. First of all, Democrats do not have a lot of opportunities to pick up seats in the Senate in 2014. This one represents one of their best chances, and it is a long shot. Federal candidates have not done very well in Kentucky. The last federal candidate, I believe, to win it was actually Bill Clinton himself. So he feels a special kinship towards the state. He's close with Allison Grimes' family, so it's one of the reasons he's pushing her. One thing Democrats cannot afford in Kentucky if they want any chance of knocking off Mitch McConnell and his over $7 million war chest, that's a primary. They don't want both of these people to run.
Yeah, and Doug, what kind of a role, Doug, do you think President Clinton might play here, given his friendship with Ms. Grimes' father, and yet Ashley Judd presenting, you know, a pretty high-profile person to run?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think if Bill and Hillary Clinton get behind her, she is going to have access to traditional Democratic donors across the country who will see their backing of her, showing that she's the viable candidate to take on the Republican leader. That would be a real challenge to Ashley Judd, who's obviously going to have to get her money from Hollywood. Yeah. And Bill Clinton's asked very often to help recruit viable candidates for office. So I think that's what's going on here.
Robert, Mitch McConnell's reaction, his camp's reaction to all this is?
Okay, bring it on. Look, Mitch McConnell is still very, very, he's not popular in Kentucky overwhelmingly, but look, remember, it's Kentucky here, and let's also remember that it's an off-year election, and let's also remember historically that the party that controls the White House historically loses seats in off-year elections. So I think the odds for Mitch McConnell are still very, very good, and quite frankly, I think they would want to run against Ashley Judd because it would be a conservative against Hollywood, and of course, from a conservative perspective, that's always a very good thing to run against.
All right, you guys, sit tight, because up next, we have your must-read.